Last class, we focused on Averroes' doctrine of the afterlife and spent a considerable amount of time on that. There were other readings, however, from his Tahafut or Incoherence of the Incoherence, which were assigned. I made two videos of those, 7a and 7b, and those are now on the course website with the other videos. If you need some help finding that website, send me an email, but it's the course website that's online, not on Toledo. But I believe Andrea will be putting those on Toledo soon. I think one of them is already on Toledo. At any rate, you can get them through the class website, the one that's online. And if you have any problems finding that, please just send me an email. So we proceed today then to our last lecture, and this will be just one lecture on Averroes on the metaphysics of Aristotle, Book Lam, which is the Arabic for Book Lambda, the Book 12 of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Here we're going to see Averroes explain in detail his understanding of the nature of creation, and to explain some of the problems that occur in the notions of creation put forward by Avicenna and Al-Ghazali. So let's proceed. First, here I want to give an overview of the thought of Averroes on the issues relating to his conception of God as creator and the kind of agency that creation is. After I give that overview, I'll go through some of the texts that were assigned in the readings for this class, and to do that to illustrate the various things that I'm going to say now as I give you this rather synthetic overview. First of all, Averroes follows Aristotle on the notion of God as final cause of the motion of the universe. Final causality involves purposefulness and the seeking out of an end. So a final cause draws things to it. So the good, for Plato, is a final cause. Things are drawn toward the good. And so too for Aristotle, good does draw us as well, in some sense. So for Aristotle, with regard to the notion of God, God is the primary instance of being, and all things are drawn to God as final cause. That this applies to all things for Aristotle is not as clear in Aristotle himself as it is in Averroes. For Aristotle himself, the notion of God as final cause was put forward to explain how there could be eternal motion in the universe. And you'll recall that Aristotle had a plurality of deities, not just one. So there are a number of interesting transformations of the teachings of Aristotle involved in what Averroes is doing, while there is also a great deal of loyalty to the kind of teachings that Aristotle put forward. So the final causality brings about motion, according to Averroes, and the heat of things of the universe, thereby causing the movement of the heavens and also the movement of sublunar things through the heat of the heavens. The heavens are eternal for Averroes, and so is the motion of the heavens. So that motion is eternal, and in this way God is the eternal cause of all things, the eternal heavens and the movers of heavenly bodies, as well as everything below. God is also the cause of the intellects that are causing the motion of the bodies of the heavens as well, but we'll look into that a bit later. So how does this take place? According to Averroes, following Aristotle's physics, motion is the actualization of the potential insofar as it is potential. Or we might say that motion is the actuality of a potency or potentiality, be it accidental or substantial. So there can be substantial change and there can be accidental change, but each involves a pre-existing potency or a potentiality for a thing to go out of existence and to become something else, another substance perhaps, or for something to go from being hot to being cold, or from being cold to being hot. This involves a pre-existing potentiality, which is then brought to actuality by something else. The heavens are moved, according to Averroes, because of love, or the primal urge of all being toward the perfection of being that's found in God. The divine finality is such that all things move toward the divine to the extent that their natures and forms will allow. For a squirrel cannot become an intellect, but it can strive for eternality through generation. So in this, the sense for Averroes then is that all things are moving toward and are drawn toward the first cause of all. In the case of humans, we do that as well, but because we have intellect, we can strive higher toward the kind of intellectual perfection that's found in God. But of course, humans cannot become God. Rather, they can share in the perfection that God always has through knowledge and understanding. And as Averroes says in Book 10, Chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the highest kind of happiness is the happiness that God has in contemplation. So to the extent that we also are involved in contemplation or intellectual understanding, then we can share in the kind of happiness that God has always. We can share in it for short periods of time. This sort of thing happens most fully when we're engaged in the science of metaphysics, according to Averroes, and the metaphysician has the most perfect form of existence available to all human beings. You may notice I'm taking that out of your readings. In fact, this state constitutes the most perfect worship of God, according to Averroes, something he states on page 10 of the first book of his long commentary on the metaphysics. You don't have that text in front of you or in the readings, but I'll provide it here for you. Here is the text. The Sharia, and remember Sharia means religious law or religion or religious practice. Here I think it's the sense of religion. The Sharia, specific to the philosophers, is the investigation of all beings, since the Creator is not worshipped by a worship more noble than the knowledge of those things that He produced, which lead to the knowledge and truth of His essence. May He be exalted. That investigation philosophers undertake is the most noble of the works belonging to Him, and the most favored of them that we do in God's presence. How great it is that one perform this service, which is the most noble of services, and one take it on with his compliant obedience, which is the most sublime of obediences. So that's on page 10 of his Metaphysics, so right toward the beginning. And I take this quite literal in what he's saying. That is, the fulfillment of human beings is to be found in knowledge of the Creator. And this fits in with his comments about metaphysics and the importance of metaphysics here as well. So the most perfect kind of worship, according to what he says here, is through knowledge, and that is knowledge of God. And that is something carried out in the science of metaphysics, most properly. So this is what philosophers are obliged to pursue. You'll recall from our study of the Fossil Macaulay, or the so-called decisive treatise, that that's what was said as well, that philosophy is obligatory for those who are able to pursue it. And here we see discussion of the highest form of philosophical study, which is identical with the highest kind of worship, the most noble kind of worship of God. God, for Averroes, is the first principle of all, and the cause of all actuality. But that causality is not by a direct efficient causality or agent causality, as we've called it, but by a final causality that brings about that brings something about in other things that strive by love and desire for the perfection of being. This, in Aristotle's Greek, is causality pros hen, or in terms of a kind of focal meaning. So everything is focused on the perfection of God and drawn toward its own perfection as it seeks to attain as much as possible the perfection that is most fully present in the perfection of being in God. In this sense, according to Averroes, then, God creates and causes the existence of things by causing their generation and actualization. That is, without directly being an efficient cause, but rather through drawing them into a more full actuality of being and their generation and their actualization. That's how creation and divine causality takes place, according to Averroes. That may work for some earthly things, but how does it work for the eternal heavens and for the intellects which are immaterial? Following Aristotle, Averroes holds that the heavens move in eternal circular perfect motion, as the heavenly bodies carry out the most perfect motion possible for them, and they do so eternally, imitating, again in their own imperfect way, the perfection of God. The intellects moving the heavenly bodies conceive of themselves and recognize the existence of God as their cause, because they find in themselves a longing and striving for something greater outside themselves, something perfect in being. In this sense, being and actuality coincide. So they're trying to find something that is most fully actual and most fully being. And they do so, in seeking this out, they do so by and fulfill themselves. To this extent, they are not fully self-contained. Even though these intellects are eternal and eternal knowers, nevertheless they're not fully self-contained. But they have in their definitions and in their very being a reference, pros hen, to the fullness of perfection of being against which they measure themselves. Their striving is caused by God's own perfection, which is a final cause for them. So they strive after the perfection of God. But of course, God in himself, as we'll see shortly, God in himself knows himself and is thought thinking thought, following the Aristotelian model. Divine creation, then, is God's eternal prompting of things to seek their own perfection by way of his final causality. This precludes any direct efficient causality, as I said earlier, for the universe is eternal in its steady, stratified state. That is, there is no creation ex nihilo here, for that is a misconception on the part of the theologians, even the theologians of all three of the faiths of the Abrahamic tradition, says Averroes. But what is the object of and nature of God's own knowledge? Following Aristotle, Averroes holds, as we've also seen Avicenna to hold too, that God should be thought, thinking thought, with himself as the most perfect object of his own knowing. But is there a way that God can know only himself and yet also know all other things? This is something worthy of investigation and thought here, because the question that we've looked at in Averroes so far has very much to do with the notion of meaning. In the other lectures, we talked about the notion of meaning and language quite often. So let's be very precise. Is there a way that God can know only himself and yet also know all other things? Well, what does it mean to know something for Aristotle? According to Aristotle himself, knowledge consists in knowing causes. So, to the extent that God knows himself, then God knows the cause of all things, the cause through final causality, the cause of the actuality of being in all other things, because God draws what is potential into actuality, and God also functions as the reference point toward which all things strive, even other intellects. So, in this way, if God knows himself, and through his very nature as the primary instance of being, God draws all things to himself by way of final causality, then it seems correct to say that insofar as God knows himself, he knows all other things. Why? Because he knows the cause of all other things, the cause of the being and actuality of all other things. So this is quite compatible then. It could be in some sense understood then that insofar as God knows himself, he knows all other things according to the Aristotelian understanding of the nature of knowledge, and yet God can be in some sense without the particular knowledge of individuals. But this is a very complex notion, and I have a paper I put on reserve for you, or it's available on the class website as well, relating to this, the nature of God in Averroes. And so I'll leave this for now. Let's now take a look at some of the texts briefly to illustrate what I've written above regarding the thought of Averroes. Because this is highly controversial, of course. It's something quite different from what we've seen already. This is a third kind of conception of the nature of creation. It certainly is a conception of creation that involves a kind of ontological dependence. That is easy to see. But how there could be creation in a significant way, and yet without the notion of efficient causality, with the notion, that is, of God who is not an efficient cause, is rather difficult to consider. And remember, Avicenna had God as an efficient cause. an eternally efficient cause that could only create one thing, and then after that, through the mediation of that one thing, namely intellect, everything else came forth. But Al-Ghazali had a different sense, we might say a more common folk sense understanding of the nature of God, that God did not have to create only through one thing, but God was much more anthropomorphic in some sense. God had will, God is able to choose, God creates what he likes, God intervenes when he likes with miracles, and that sort of thing in Al-Ghazali. This, though, in what Averroes puts forward, is something very, very different, very Aristotelian. In a sense, in fact, he's taking the Aristotelian account of the dependence of everything on the first cause and calling that creation. And he's quite explicit about that, as we'll see in several of these texts. So let's go on and take a look at some of those texts. The assigned readings consisted of portions of Averroes' commentary, and in particular those corresponding to the following texts, that is 18, 36, 37, 43, 44, 51, and that's 52 as well. In the comment, so let's look at some of these in detail. In the comment to text 18, Averroes attacks the Platonic theory of forms and explains that things are generated not by participation in transcendent forms, as Plato would have it, but by what is like in species, a very Aristotelian teaching. What already has the form generates a form like it. So the father generates the child, plants the seed and generates the child in the mother, and the mother gives birth to the child in that way. And so this is natural generation. And this does not involve a participation of a kind of separate form, as Plato would have it. Averroes also mentions the theory of Avicenna in this context and the notion of the giver of forms, but he also rejects that. You'll recall the notion of the giver of forms for Avicenna is that the first cause creates things, but ultimately in the lowest level of the various intelligences in the emanative hierarchy, there is the agent intellect. And the agent intellect is responsible for creating all the forms of the world and also for providing forms to the individual human intellect. Avicenna did not see a kind of natural change in the world taking place without the involvement of the agent intellect, which is full of all the forms. And when the material constituents are prepared in the proper way, then they receive from the agent intellect the form to make something be. And that's how the species are continued, according to Avicenna, because he has the doctrine that all the forms are in the agent intellect. Averroes then proceeds to distinguish three views. One is the view of creation as latency, that says all things are in all things, and they emerge from one another such that agency is needed only to help them separate and come forth. So everything is already in all things, and some agency is needed just to separate them, in some sense. Another is creation ex nihilo, held by the people of faith, who hold that matter too is created. Ibn Sina is, in some sense, in this group, of course, since he speaks of the giver of forms or agent intellect as the cause of the forms and being of things, but also has the notion, the doctrine of the necessary being and the primacy of God as creator in this. So, and God also, according to Ibn Sina, then, in some sense, also creates matter. Of course, not temporally, but eternally. But the third is what Averroes says he takes from Aristotle. He's quite explicit about this, saying that he takes this from Aristotle. It is this, quote, that the agent produces only the compound from matter and form by moving the matter and changing it to educe the potentiality it has for the form into actuality. This, according to Averroes, is what takes place in creation. So what he's saying is the ordinary substantial change of the universe is in fact what should be properly understood as creation, and indicates also the presence of God, perhaps indirectly, but the presence of God as well involved, and would not take place without God involved. This is further explained in the comment to text 37, where Averroes speaks of providence, and he writes the following regarding providence. This is the source of the providence of God for all the existence. He knows them by species, since it is not possible to know them numerically. The view that those who think that God's providence extends to every person is right in a sense and wrong in another. It is right insofar as nobody is in a condition peculiar to him, but this condition belongs to the class of this species. That is, the conditions that we have are those that belong to us as members of a species. He goes on, if this is so, it is correct to say that God takes care of individuals in this way. That is, he means by way of God's taking care of the species. He goes on, but providence for an individual in which nobody else shares is something which the divine bounty does not necessitate. Notice then what he's doing. He's denying providence can act on individuals. Rather, God's providential care is at the level of species. And so, thanks to God, then the human species tries to achieve actuality, each individual tries to achieve actuality within the limits of the species, and therein lies the providence of God. Is there a particular providence? No, that's what Averroes is denying here. There is no necessity for a particular providence. You might want to think about what that means with regard to religion and religious revelation. In the comment to text 44, Averroes explains that there is no efficient causality among immaterial entities, because there is no potentiality in them. Let's be careful about what this actually means then. Immaterial entities have no matter and are not subject to substantial change. They don't have the potentiality for that. And so the kind of causality that they can have is not that of motion. Motion does not affect them because they're immaterial. So for Averroes in general then, there is no efficient or agent causality among immaterial entities. And we'll see that applies to God as well. So he has a very different sense of creation here. Here's his quotation. The habit of our contemporaries to say that such and such a mover proceeds from such and such a mover or emanates from it, obviously he has Avicenna in mind here, or follows necessarily, or similar expressions, is something which is not correct in the case of these separate principles. He means the separate intellects that are behind the movements of the heavens. He goes on, all these are supposed to be attributes of agents, but they are not so in truth. For we have said before that what proceeds from the agent merely passes from potentiality into actuality. And then I highlight this, but there is no potentiality there, so there is no agent either. That is, there is no agent causality among immaterial entities. Hence, the relationship between God and other intelligences in the world is not one of motion and potentiality. It will have a different meaning. And so if God is the creator of other intellects in the hierarchy of intellects behind the movement of the heavens, then the nature of that creation will be different from efficient causality or agent causality. He continues, quote, there is only intellect and intelligible, perfecting and perfected, in the same way as the techniques perfect each other by deriving their principles from the other. And each of them, in its own realm, derives all its principles from the total comprehensive technique. This is why we see that the science concerned with the first, praise be he, is that which first philosophy contains. And of course, first philosophy here is metaphysics. The science concerned with the principles which are below it is similar to the particular sciences which are below first philosophy. So first philosophy will concern, in addition to other things, it will concern the relationship of things at the higher level. Let's go on. He continues further. This is why we see that the man who has attained this science has achieved the most perfect state of existence. This is the science of metaphysics. And that it is the best of his actions because it is the action in which the best being shares. What is said on the authority of Plato's myth, namely that the Creator created the angels himself and then entrusted them with the creation of mortal animals and remained himself idle and inactive is a myth, which it is wrong to take as truth. It may be that an imputation on the Creator is the cause of the obligation of the Sabbath in the religion of the Jews. So he relates this to religion as well. Okay, the notion also the Sabbath is when God rests and that sort of thing as well. That's what he has in mind here. But the main point here is that the proper sense of God as Creator is not as something that creates ex nihilo. Let's go on further. In the comment to text 51, Averroes pursues the question of the nature of God's knowledge and says that it is something, quote, every man desires by nature, close quote. Of course, that's very similar to the beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics, the first book. All human beings by nature desire to know. And I'm sure Averroes has that in mind. Averroes then explains the truth of the issue as he sees it. And I quote, the truth is that because it knows only itself, and the it here is God, as self-knower and immaterial, the truth is that because it knows only itself, it knows the existence through the existence which is the cause of their existences. Now, that's a bit difficult to even speak in a sense, let alone understand, but this is precisely what I indicated earlier, that is that God knows all existing things through the existence which is the cause of their existences, that is, through self-knowledge. Since knowing himself, then God knows the cause, and then thereby, according to the Aristotelian account of knowledge, God knows things that are below him, because he is the cause of them. He goes on, for instance, one does not say, with regard to him who knows the heat of fire only, that he has no knowledge of the nature of the heat existing in hot things. But he is the one who knows the nature of heat qua heat. Let's go on. He continues, likewise, the first praise to him is he who knows absolutely the nature of being qua being, which is his essence. Be careful now, notice what he's saying. God is knowing himself. Therefore, the word knowledge is said of his knowledge and our knowledge by homonymy, that is, equivocally. The meaning of the term is not the same. Our knowledge, as we've already seen, our knowledge is derivative upon sense perception, and God's knowledge is causative of things. But the question that you should think of as philosophers here is, does the term knowledge really have the proper conceptual content in each case? Or is it so radically different that they're not even the same kinds of things? Or to put it another way, what is the similarity between divine knowledge and human knowledge that allows us to say that they are conceptually similar in some fashion? If they're not conceptually similar, then what is their relationship? Are they just absolutely different meanings of terms? He continues, quote, for his knowledge is the cause of being, and being is the cause of our knowledge. And his knowledge cannot be described as universal nor as particular. We've seen this already. He's writing this later work now, this commentary on the metaphysics, around 1190, but he had already said this earlier when he was writing the Fossil Macaw, and also that treatise on divine knowledge that I mentioned as well. So we go on. His knowledge cannot be described as universal nor as particular, for he whose knowledge is universal knows potentially the particulars, which are in actuality, and the object of his knowledge is of necessity knowledge and potentiality, since the universal knowledge is only knowledge of particular things. If the universal knowledge is knowledge and potentiality, and there is no potentiality in his knowledge, then of course his knowledge is not universal. He continues further, a clearer argument is that his knowledge is not particular, because the particulars are infinite, and no knowledge encompasses them. He is not characterized by the knowledge which is in us, nor by the ignorance which is its opposite. just as that which is not fit to possess any of these two, knowledge and ignorance, is not characterized by them. So knowledge and ignorance, as we understand them, are not appropriate to God. I continue. The existence of a knowing existent which is not characterized by the knowledge which is in us, nor by the ignorance which is in us, and whose existence is not distinct from his knowledge, has thus become evident. So God's existence and God's knowledge are identical, and yet the term knowledge doesn't mean the same as anything within our conceptual grasp, it appears. It's an interesting philosophical issue. And in the comment to text 52, he writes again of Providence. He writes, quote, "It must be known to you that this is Aristotle's view concerning Providence, that the problems arising about Providence are solved by his view. For there are people who say that there is nothing for which God does not care, because they claim that the sage, that is God, must not leave anything without providence, and must not do evil, and that all his actions are just." Obviously, he's talking here about Christians and Jews and some Muslims as well. Other people refuted this theory through the fact that many things happen that are evil, and that the sage, God, should not produce them. So these people went to the opposite extreme and said that therefore there is no providence at all. We go on. He continues then, quote, "The truth in this is that providence exists." He's going to qualify this, and that what happens contrary to providence is due to the necessity of matter. So providence can be disrupted by the necessity of matter. He goes on, "Not to the shortcomings of the Creator," so that some people carried on their reflection on this to the point that they said that there are two gods, a God who created evil and a God who created the good. Obviously he has in mind Zoroastrians here, and certainly he's going to reject that himself. But notice here then that divine providence is going to turn out to be just the care that God has as final cause for all things. And it's at the level of species, as we saw earlier. It's not at the level of particulars. So God is thinking thought, primarily focused on himself, knowing other things only through the fact that he is cause of all other things, as a final cause, not an efficient cause. Now, one of the philosophical questions to ask here is that a coherent conception of divine knowledge of things? That is, isn't efficient causality in some sense required? Or is final causality sufficient in knowing all things? And how does this reflect on the nature of the concept of creation that Averroes puts forward? This is a very interesting and challenging philosophical issue. From all this, it's clear that the conception of creation ex nihilo is completely rejected by Averroes and replaced by a notion of eternal ontological dependence. This, of course, had great ramifications for his philosophy and especially for his conception of the nature and function of religion. Obviously, there's quite a bit here that would be relevant for a course paper as well. But what is clear is that he has thought deeply about the nature of creation and has found a way to assert a concept of creation that is coherent with Aristotelian philosophical thought. It's for this kind of thing, even if they don't fully know it, that modern people in the looking at the history of Muslim thought look back to Averroes as a prime instance of someone who was able to reconcile philosophy and religion. But my own thought is that quite often they don't realize what this means, and they don't fully understand the extent to which this means the subservience of religion to philosophy. And I think there's much more about the understanding of the nature of religion and the understanding of philosophy itself that those who praise Averroes as a monumental thinker who reconciled philosophy and religion should be much more cautious about asserting. It's a very complex notion that he's dealing with here. So he's reconciled to religious faith and the reason of science. But at what price? So this is our final lecture on Averroes and the final lecture on the Arabic Islamic philosophical tradition. Next class will be looking at the text of Thomas Aquinas, where he draws upon materials that we've studied now from the Arabic tradition and forms his own conception of creation. And we'll be looking at texts initially from the Commentary on the Sentences of Peter Lombard, again, Aquinas' first major work of theology, which contains a considerable amount of philosophical material as well. And that's also next week. Professor Robilio will be taking over the lead in the presentation of lectures, but we'll both be present for the entire class. I'll be present via the internet connection. I'll be seeing and listening to the lectures, and I'll be available for discussion as well. So the two of us will be there for the remaining classes together. It's just that I'll be there through the internet. All right, thank you very much.